Okay, we are live and we're doing this. So, so this is the Friday video, hopefully. We're picking it up from where we left it off in Wednesday's class. And I'm not really able to see what I've got going on here in terms of the, my microphone pickup. But, we do what we can. Okay, so we were talking about Edward Bernays and his, I guess I should close this door so that I don't bore the doors off of everybody. Talking about Edward Bernays and his post-war career. The 1920s would be very good to Edward Bernays. He, in turn, would be very good to the tobacco business. Before World War I, cigarette smoking was looked on as a rather unsavory thing. This is a picture of Albert Meadors, who was a train robber from Eastern Oregon sheep country just before the war. The image of the Marlboro Man, to the contrary, a cowboy who smoked cigarettes, was looked on as one step removed from a habitual drunk. They called them cigarette fiends. You'll notice that Mr. Meadors here is smoking a small cigar, a cigarillo, I guess it would be. A cigarette smoker was not allowed to spend the night in the livery stable like the other cowboys. The fear was that he would light up and burn the place down. Pipe and cigar smokers were considered fine. They supposedly could control their cigarette habits, but cigarette smokers, they had to have a cigarette when it was time for a cigarette. And that addiction was widely seen as a symbol of moral inadequacy. Users of snuff and chew, widely considered okay, but not cigarettes, which was kind of weird because those are highly addictive substances too, so why wouldn't you be a beech nut fiend or a Copenhagen fiend? But, people aren't always rational. Well, speaking of which, this all started to change during the war, so the First World War. And during the war, cigarettes, frankly, are the most convenient nicotine delivery system there is. Packages of them were included in soldiers' rations because nicotine is probably the most useful drug for people in combat. Consequently, there's a reason that just about everyone under fire in wartime smokes. It's because it's probably going to keep them alive, because it's just really, really useful. Consequently, hundreds of thousands of doughboys returned from combat with cigarette habits, and cigarette smoking went from unmanly to super macho. So going into the 1920s, cigarette manufacturers found themselves basically riding a tiger. But for some of them, that tiger wasn't running fast enough. This ad is a little racy. Do you inhale, darling? Anyway, in 1926, Bernays coordinated a response by Chesterfields to the Lucky Strike ad that claimed that cigarettes were so kind to your throat that opera smokers smoked them, because obviously inhaling smoke isn't a kindly thing to do to your throat, unless, of course, they're Lucky Strikes and you're an opera singer. Well, the response was basically to make fun of the whole thing. Edward Bernays was basically making fun of the whole thing. Chesterfield was the brand he was pushing, and all I could find was the Ronald Reagan ones, which are pretty famous. But anyway, he claimed to have created an imaginary support group for singers and public performers whose voices had broken down under the strain, not of smoking the wrong cigarette, but of all the endorsements that they'd have to do. Talk about how wonderful the cigarettes were. Anyway, the owner of the Lucky Strike brand, that would be a man named George Washington Hill, noticed this. And so then he poached Bernays out from under the Chesterfield people, hired him himself. Now, Hill wanted women to start smoking more cigarettes and to choose Lucky Strikes as their favorite brand. Other professionals working for him had come up with a slogan, a general approach that he thought would appeal to women. And that approach was, reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet. Now it was time for Bernays to take it on. The results of this were both amazing and appalling. The most obvious part of the campaign was, of course, the ads. We looked at some of those on Wednesday. They're awful. In newspapers and magazines and other print media, you would see slender young flappers in modern dress with a stubby old-school cigarette dangling delicately from their fingers, with copy saying something like, when tempted to overindulge, reach for a Lucky instead. Other promotional activities were pretty easy to spot as well. A number of the then red-hot Ziegfeld's Follies girls signed a pledge, quote, to renounce the false pleasures of the table, fattening foods, drinks, and cloying sweets, but I make no sacrifices. I shall smoke cigarettes. Well, amusing as this sort of thing was, it wasn't much different from the old opera star smokes our brand approach, right? What was really different was that Bernays was crystallizing public opinion. That was his term. He called it crystallizing public opinion. He actually wrote a book by that title. And this was done far more quietly, sometimes even secretly. And what it actually involved was the manipulation of popular culture. Here, by the way, is my favorite Lucky Strike, don't stop smoking because you'll get too fat ad of the lean athletic athlete going up. I thought this was basketball, but it's obviously something else. I don't know what he's doing, but the Chris Farley guy behind him is obviously doing it better. Anyway, crystallizing public opinion was very different from shaping or changing public opinion, because Bernays knew he couldn't do that. He couldn't make pop culture go someplace that it didn't want to be. And so he knew that. And he also knew that trying to do that would be futile and hucksterish. You know, like a crappy used car salesman trying to pressure a customer into buying a car that he or she doesn't really want. You know, but where his talents really were going to shine, was in guiding culture to move faster in a direction it was already going, or in offering his product as a handy touchstone for expressing oneself when, if left to one's own devices, one would have probably settled on something, but not necessarily that. This was where the big money was. Now, late 1920s society, already trending toward more slender standards of beauty in women. What Bernays saw was that if he could hitch his Lucky Strike's wagon to this star, he could have a powerful and profitable engine of profit if, in the public imagination, smoking his cigarette would be the road to the slim profile that they wanted to attain. Well, he'd sell a ton. So the first thing to do is to solidify the trend towards slender women. And so he got a photographer friend to conduct an informal survey, sending letters out to other style professionals. And those letters said this: I have come to the conclusion that the slender woman who, combining suppleness and grace with slenderness, who, instead of overeating sweets and desserts, lights a cigarette, as the advertisements say, has created a new standard of female loveliness. I am interested in knowing if my own judgment concurs with that of others, and should be most happy to have your opinion on the subject. Okay, so now this is a little bit like asking a bunch of computer professionals today if wireless broadband is a good idea. They're like, yeah, right? All the people Bernays' friend was hitting up were photographers and artists in the business of creating contemporary cultural iconography and imagery. They were in the forefront of the trend towards slender woman iconography. They were pushing this bus. He knew very well what they were going to say. They weren't going to say, oh yeah, that thing that we're doing, it's just totally bogus. No. But the trend was new enough yet that nobody had studied it yet. And so by asking this question, what Bernays was doing was crystallizing a trend that was already there, but in more chaotic form. And once that was done, he prepared a report and sent it to various newspapers, which dutifully reported the trend towards being skinny. The same thing was being done with dancers and actors and athletes and, of course, physicians. And soon, easy news article opportunities were everywhere, all neatly scrubbed of any evidence of influence by Bernays or Lucky Strikes. A dancing school honcho wrote that, quote, on the dance floor, results of overindulgence are quickly revealed. Now, you can imagine how mortifying it would be to contemplate the possibility that your dancing instructor is judging your lifestyle based on evidence of overindulgence. Yeah, so that was not really fighting fair, was it? Also, this quote added, that the dance instructor added, dancers today, when tempted to overindulge at the punch bowl or the buffet, hey, that rhymes, reach for a cigarette instead, which makes you think that maybe he'd been schooled on what to say. The former head of the British Association of Medical Officers of Health released a statement that said sweets cause tooth decay, which I suppose they probably do. Wait a minute, I suppose they probably do. Of course they do. That's why I have a solid steel mouth like that Bond villain in that horrible 1970s movie with Roger Moore. But anyway, here's what he had to say, this British guy. And this is funny. Some of these guys... The correct way to finish a meal is with fruit, coffee, and a cigarette. The fruit hardens the gums and cleans the teeth. The coffee stimulates the flow of saliva and acts as a mouthwash, while finally the cigarette disinfects the mouth and soothes the nerves. That wasn't supposed to be an English accent. I can't do an RP accent. I don't know why. I'm just talking funny. So... don't judge me. Anyway, with Bernays manipulating public opinion in favor of more slender styles, and Lucky Strike's ads urging women to stay skinny by smoking instead of eating, Lucky Strike's cigarette sales surged ahead. Everyone could see the ads urging folks to smoke. What they couldn't see, and what Bernays was at some pains to make sure that they never noticed, was the subtle manipulation of the very fabric of popular culture to bring people naturally and effortlessly to a mind space in which they would be maximally receptive to those ads and to other social stimuli that would be inspired by those ads, in which people he wasn't even paying would say things like, "Why don't you start smoking? Honey, you're putting on a bunch of weight. Why don't you start smoking cigarettes?" I'm sorry. It is not really funny, but it is kind of funny. I guess we can laugh at it because it happened so long ago. From this success, Bernays almost immediately moved on to an even more audacious swindle, if you will. George Washington Hill, the owner of Lucky Strikes, you will have noticed by now that the guy was never satisfied, right? So Bernays is driving all kinds of business to his door. What does he want? More business. It's just never enough. So what he wants to do now is he wants to get women to start smoking cigarettes on the streets as well as indoors. And he figures if he can get them to start smoking cigarettes on the street... At the time, see, there was a taboo. And there was a fading taboo, but it was still in effect, right, against women smoking in public. Now, this taboo was being worn down. Originally, it had been against women smoking at all. And this cartoon dates from about 1905, before the First World War, and it's supposed to show how, repulsive and repugnant and horrible and unladylike it looks like when a young lady lights a cigarette and smokes it. So you can see the young man moving diffidently away from her on the couch like she's the tiger or something like that. I don't know, maybe she shot that tiger personally. Anyway, she looks badass to me. I don't know what those people were smoking. But anyway, so this taboo, it was being worn down. It had been this, then it was just on the streets, right? Smoke them if you got them, but only if you're in your own private place. Otherwise, we don't want to see that. Anyway, Hill felt that he could sell a lot more cigarettes if women felt comfortable lighting one up on the promenade. For Bernays, this was almost the perfect opportunity to crystallize a clearly recognizable trend away from taboos against women lighting up, and in the process to get it to crystallize in a distinctly pro-smoking way rather than, as would have probably happened in a sort of a neutral smoke 'em if you got 'em kind of way, and a pro-Lucky Strikes way. Like, Lucky is the cigarette to smoke if you are, wanting to tell the man to get stuffed because you're going to do what you want. So the result became known as the Torches of Freedom campaign. And the goal was not just for smoking cigarettes on the street to be seen as okay for women, but to have it be seen as an act of triumph and celebration and defiance of the old stifling ways. Ding Dong the Witch's Dead dance being done on the freshly filled grave of the anti-women suffrage movement. Now remember, this is less than 10 years after women won the right to vote. I've had to train myself to never say women were given the right to vote, because they weren't given the right to vote. They had to frickin' take it, and they did. And they were very proud of that. And it had been less than 10 years. And these are not the demure, tightly corseted ladies of the 1910s who were kept in the home and denied the right to vote. These are modern 1920s women. They voted for whoever they wanted to. They wore daring clothes that gave them freedom of movement, and they celebrated their freedom with a new symbol of the triumph of modernity. Women and women's suffrage and liberation, the torch of freedom, the lit cigarette. That was the vision. Bernays got right to work making it happen. And it was a raging success. He totally, I mean, we went from very few women being addicted to cigarettes to more than half of American women being addicted to cigarettes, so I guess he did okay. First, he got a list of prominent debutantes from a friend at Vogue magazine, and then he asked his secretary to send each of them a telegram, which read as follows. In the interest of equality of the sexes and to fight another sex taboo, I and other young women will light another torch of freedom by smoking cigarettes while strolling on Fifth Avenue Easter Sunday. We are doing this to combat the silly prejudice that the cigarette is suitable for the home, the restaurant, the taxicab, the theater lobby, but never, no, never for the sidewalk. Women smokers and their escorts will stroll between 48th Street and 54th Street on Fifth Avenue between 11:30 and 1 o'clock. Now, the list of women who received these telegrams and other methods of contact was very carefully managed. Bernays did not want any actresses or showgirls involved because he didn't want anyone to think it was a publicity stunt, or rather, didn't want anyone to know or realize it was a publicity stunt, because that's exactly what it was. He wanted women to be selected to be relatable, nice-looking women, but not too modelly. And the women were selected and assembled in Bernays' office on Good Friday and given their final instructions. And this is a quote from the great man himself. They should be told where and when they are to be on duty Easter morning and furnished with lucky strikes. As the fashionable churches are crowded on Easter, they must be impressed with the necessity of going early. Business must be worked out as if by a theatrical director, as for example, one woman, seeing another smoke, opens her purse, finds cigs but no matches, asks another for light. At least some of the women should have men with them. These are instructions that he gave to his secretary because he didn't want anybody to know that he had anything to do with it. It's his secretary's idea, right? She came up with this, all by herself, without any help from any man thing. That was the vision. You know, the revolution will be co-opted by people like this. Anyway, the event was something of a sensation, and it was carried in newspapers nationwide and sparked ferocious debate among different newspapers and service organizations and women's clubs, as well as individual citizens writing letters to the editor, all arguing over whether women should be smoking in public. Among the population of girls and young women who, because of nicotine's addictive properties, were the most important subjects of the campaign, there was no question about the effectiveness of this campaign. Smoking a cigarette was now one of the most powerful, self-defining statements a young woman could make. It identified her as modern, it differentiated her from her mother and dowdy Aunt Agatha. It was a cinch. Now, keep in mind that Bernays was always at great pains to avoid letting anyone know that American Tobacco, which was Hill's company, right, the makers of Lucky Strikes, was behind these efforts. For the Torches of Freedom promotion, his secretary was quoted in the newspapers claiming the whole thing was her idea and denying any connection to any firm. And you know what? I bet you it was her idea. Because it would be just like this guy to take credit for something that she came up with. But leaving that aside, he left instructions that under no circumstances was anyone responding to any of his stuff to be told that he was associated with this in any way. He was the power behind the throne or whatever. But I just now thought of this while I was preparing this lecture. I bet you it was her idea, because that would just so totally be like him. Anyway, a lesser-known example of Bernays' work was in swinging the nationwide fashion trends so that Lucky Strike's packages wouldn't clash with women's outfits. Now, strategically, this was not such a hot move. Strategically, tactically, it was great. Strategically, no, because this year's hot trend is guaranteed to be dated and embarrassing in 2 years. But, tactically, it was a remarkable triumph. At the time, Lucky Strikes came in a green pack with a red target dot in the middle, like in this ad here. Not long afterwards, this was changed to a beige pack with a red target dot, probably for this very reason, because George Washington Hill, the owner, like a lot of very sexist men from before the Second World War, was convinced that all women cared about was fashion and aesthetics and looking fetching and whatnot. And he didn't want to change the color of the packs, but he was convinced that women were smoking Camels because the packages The Lucky Strike packages clashed with their outfits. What to do? So, pulling every lever and pushing every button, basically, Bernays launched a campaign to get everyone to decide that red and green were the hot colors. He commissioned a green ball at the Waldorf Astoria, a green fashions fall luncheon, a new color fashions bureau to help encourage green interior decor, lectures on, quote, green in the work of great artists, and so on and so on. And he got prominent women from Mrs. Della V. Chrysler to Eleanor Roosevelt to Ellen Berlin, who was Irving Berlin's wife, to start wearing green. And headlines started appearing in newspapers that said it looks like a green winter. And then, triumph of triumphs, the moment of greatest greatest satisfaction and excitement was this advertisement. A woman in a Camel cigarette ad shown wearing a green outfit, proof positive that Eddie's cover had not been blown and that the people at Camel cigarettes had no idea that their rivals were behind this new fashion trend. Another thing that he did, now, the Lucky Strikes people also made Cremo cigars, which, I don't know, Cremo, I don't know, it smokes creamy. Anyway, Cremo cigars, this was a campaign that Edward Bernays helped with. Competing cigars were made by hand, rolled by hand with the blunt end formed in the cigar maker's mouth, where the saliva moistened it and formed it. So here we have a picture of a rough-looking character, with your cigar in his mouth, spitting all over it. Ew, right? But that was the advertisement. He wasn't actually doing the ads. What he was doing was trying to get everybody to recoil in disgust from an ad like this. His job was to change popular culture. So, like I said, Cremo had mechanized a system that dispensed with the spittle. They could make a cigar by sticking, tobacco in a machine, and the machine would, make the cigar without anybody spitting on anything. So Bernays knew that they could sell lots of cigars if they presented them Cremo as a spit-free cigar. Okay, that was easy. But he also knew that if he could really whip up public disgust over spittle, he could drive a lot more business to Cremo. So he set about doing exactly that, crystallizing public opinion from a general negative feeling towards spitting in public to outright revulsion. Now, remember something else, too. If any of you guys remember or happen to consume what they now anodyne call smokeless tobacco, chewing tobacco, people generally, spit the... they call it tobacco juice, but it isn't really juice. It's tobacco-infused spit that you're squirting out of your mouth all the time. So people who are spitting in public are either consumptives or tobacco chewers. And so what he was trying to do here, Mr. Bernays, was to crystallize the public towards thinking that was super disgusting, which not long before it had not been super disgusting because lots and lots of people didn't. It was just quite common. You would spit in the spittoon, it would go ding, and if you didn't use the spittoon, well, that was gross. And of course, if you were a consumptive and you were coughing up bloody spittle, that was also gross, but that wasn't kind of what everybody went to right away when they saw somebody spitting in public. They went to, oh, chewing tobacco, wonder what kind of weather we're going to have tomorrow. Now he was getting people, trying to crystallize people, because fewer people were chewing, and chewing tobacco was becoming more of a working class thing rather than an upper class thing as class divisions were starting to form. It had never been an upper class thing. But anyway, he got physicians to expound on the bad health effects of gobs of spit on the sidewalk, got city councils to pass ordinances against expectorating in public, so that if you were going to chew tobacco, you had to do it in your own house so you could spit in your own sink. It was highly successful, this campaign was. Oh, that was all in good, clean fun, right? Nobody knew that cigarettes killed you until the early 1950s, so at least we know that Bernays wasn't cynically helping hook millions of Americans with a debilitating addiction and dooming many of them to die in mortal agony 20, 30 years later, short of breath, suffocating. Right? No. Sorry. According to historian Larry Tye, who wrote Bernays' biography, Bernays' papers indicate very clearly that by about 1930 he had good reason to suspect that cigarettes were dangerous. By 1933, he was actually warning the top American tobacco executives that a response was going to have to be prepared because scientific studies were starting to find things like increased cancer growths in rabbits that were exposed to tobacco smoke, and statistical correlations that were showing a worrisome linkage between tobacco use and lung cancer, because now all of a sudden lots and lots of people were actually inhaling tobacco smoke. They had been since World War I. It's now like 10 or 15 years after World War I. That's about how long it takes to start seeing some serious lung cancer cases. So he was already getting a response ready. He said, do this. Lay down a barrage to the editors of the country, reflecting to them authoritative opinion on the cigarette in relation to the physiology of the human body, doing this not so much with the purpose of getting this material printed, but doing it rather to build up such a constructive picture of the cigarette in the minds of the editors that when a story of the type I am sending you, this of course accompanied a story about how cigarettes were going to kill people, they will hesitate to print it because they will have been convinced of the contrary point of view. Okay, now that is super smooth. Here's how Larry Tye puts it, and I can't put it better. The cynicism of this approach is inescapable. Bernays took seriously the medical evidence that he was gathering on the dangers of smoking, yet he was urging the American tobacco people to do all they could to ensure that newspaper editors dismiss that evidence. He was also working with some doctors who were still willing to argue a pro-tobacco line from the medical standpoint. One particularly funny one, even funnier than the British medical guys one, came from a physician named Clarence Lieb. Check this out. Men worship at various shrines: Venus, Bacchus, Mars, Ceres, and Lady Nicotine. The least harmful is the latter. The benefits of tobacco are: 1. It is a pleasure. 2. A good laxative after breakfast, and honestly I don't want to know what he means by that. 3. Checks obesity by lessening the appetite. 4. Aids nutrition by stimulating the secretory functions of the stomach. 5. It consoles the lonely. Consolation. 6. It aids in contemplation. 7. It is a manual as well as an oral activity. That's a little racy. I'm going to leave that one alone. 8. It promotes sociability. Lieb goes on to say that smoking is not for everyone. The people who should not smoke include the very young. Yeah, you don't want to teach your baby to smoke cigarettes, although somebody actually did teach Alan Alda to smoke a pipe when he was like 2, but that was just for a photograph. The very old, so when you get old, you got to go cold turkey. People suffering from heartburn, malnutrition, loose bowels, asthma or chronic disease, and this is another quote from Dr. Lieb, those individuals of whom there are some who have an idiosyncrasy against strawberries or cucumbers. So if you are allergic to strawberries, no ciggies for you. In later years, Bernays would try pretty hard to walk all this back, but the fact was he was making a very good living persuading people to poison themselves. By 1930, he probably knew it. By 1933, he unquestionably knew it. There's a lot more to know about Edward Bernays. Later in his life, he did some very good things that we should mention, if nothing else, out of fairness. But actually, I do think that it may be due to his somewhat guilt-ridden actions in the 70s and 80s that we got the current kind of backlash against cigarettes, in which they went from being a prop to pose with if you were cool to, a marker of, coarseness, if you will. He worked very hard to fight racism and sexism in real ways, too, as opposed to the empty symbolism of the Torches of Freedom walk. He lent his skills to the anti-smoking campaigns. Like I said, it's possible that the stigma against cigarette smoking that exists today, which is a total revolutionary reversal from how it was when I was your age, a little younger. When I was in high school, the cool kids smoked or chewed. It's entirely possible that reversal owes something to his efforts. He wrote a book in 1928 titled Propaganda. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but I didn't. Propaganda starts out first rattle out of the box with some profoundly chilling thoughts, which I'm going to quote at length from here as a more pleasant alternative to making you guys read the book. Okay, so here it goes. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. This is deep state theory here going on. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Our invisible governors are in many cases unaware of the identity of the fellow members of the inner cabinet. They govern us by their qualities of natural leadership, their ability to supply needed ideas, and by their key position in the social structure. Whatever attitude one chooses to take toward this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or in business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by this relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness the social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. In other words, real power in society is a shadowy fraternity of puppet masters who decide what we like, who we support, whether we have war or peace, and he adds this is a good and democratic thing. One almost expects him to start talking about how fluoride in the water is the mind control chemical that enables the government to do all of this. But it isn't surprising that he thinks it's a good and democratic thing, because he's representing himself as a representative of that class of puppet masters. We always trust in the inherent goodness of forces that we control. It's the ones others control that freak us out. When your preferred political party is in power, you're not usually as worried about, the world being nuked or whatever as when the opposite party is running the show. Which is why nearly every, that trust in the inherent goodness of forces we control is why nearly every invading army in modern history expected to be welcomed as liberators, and with one or two exceptions, never were. So, yeah, so much for Bernays' theory. Let's finish this discussion by looking at his practice. Bernays died in 1995. He was 104 years old, and he did not get to be that old by smoking Lucky Strikes. He didn't smoke at all. He never smoked. He explained, and this is a quote, "I don't like the taste. I prefer chocolate." Now, I'm not sure whether that was supposed to be a self-deprecating joke. After all, he made his name by convincing modern young women to substitute Lucky Strikes for chocolate and other sweets. But if it was supposed to be a joke, I'm not sure I'd characterize it as particularly funny. What's more telling, though, are his extreme efforts to get his wife Doris to quit her one-pack-a-day habit smoking parliaments. He would hide the cigarettes. He would get the kids to find and hide the cigarettes. He would he'd flush them down the toilet when he found them. And finally, in the late 1940s, a physician told Doris that the smoking was causing circulation problems in her leg, and that if it didn't get better, they would have to amputate. Now, the ludicrousness of this diagnosis from a medical standpoint suggests that the physician must have been coached, or at least encouraged by Edward. If so, mission accomplished, right? The prospect of losing a leg scared Doris so badly that she just quit. Cold turkey, on the spot, done. So that's one life that Bernays' inside knowledge of the cigarette industry probably saved. Give that boy a gold star. On the other hand, don't. Because I'm going to tell you right now, there's about a 1 in 10 chance that he helped kill your great-grandmother. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward Bernays. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys on Monday. And now I'm going to dorkily put all my things away and get back on my screen to the spot where I tell it to stop recording. And okay, bye!